Can't hear you.
Getachew, we can hear you. We can hear you, Getachew.
I'm not hearing anything, Getachew.
Yeah, we can hear him.
Hello. What about now? You can hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Very, very faintly.
Okay. I'll fix that in the meantime. I apologize for the technical issues we have. The H panel starts now. And those who are following us on YouTube, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter, please share so that many others can reach out to our material and we get more viewership. Today we'll be talking about the topic of, is holding Ethiopia together feasible? Is it worth the effort? That's a question we'll be asking today. And I'm pleased to have back again the two regular panelists, Faisal Roble and Professor Esther Gabisa, and have a new panelist, Dr. John Yang from Canada. So we'll be talking about the main topic shortly. Some of the intros we usually do in terms of the big ticket items for each panelist, they might be related or not related to the topic. So we'll start as usual with that. So what stood out for you, Faisal? What stood out for you in the past 7 days?
Thank you very much, Getachew. I think where I'm sitting in my house, the internet is delaying. So if you don't mind, I can go down to a better place and you can start with a scale in the meantime. So I can rejoin. So I can change the location unless you are hearing me very well. Can you?
We can hear you very well.
Okay. So like millions of people, both Ethiopians as well as outsiders, I think stood for me is the joint report from Amnesty and from Human Rights Watch. It's a very exhaustive report. It's both a teaching moment or document as well as a report that really calls the entire world, including perpetrators of the massive crime in Western Tigray, as well as anybody who deals with Ethiopia to action, a call for action. It's very educating in the sense that for the Ethiopians and people who are interested in this concept, the report goes into detail as to the meaning of what's ethnic cleansing, what is crimes against humanity or war crimes, and all those issues are applicable to the situation, and they all took place. With ethnic cleansing, it's people being moved out of their residence by force through ethnic identification. It's all, and they find definition from United Nations Commission experts that really identified 3 factors that delineate what ethnic cleansing is, one of which is a purposeful policy by a group or government to move people from their residences, also removal by force, and then violent or using the violence to move people. As I said, it's a timely report. It is really finally bringing to our homes issues that we have been talking about. Those of us who are close to the issue, we know very well. We have talked in various spaces about this issue. But what is very interesting about this report is it makes very hefty recommendations to all types of actors, including to Ethiopian government, which is the main perpetrator, the Amara regional forces and Amara regional government, to TPLF, also some recommendations. But I found some of the really interesting recommendations to be the ones that they are also making to the international world. Interesting simply because I know already the Ethiopian government rejected the entirety of the report, although they came back today with a lukewarm message to say that they will look into it. But I think all the corrective measures that they recommended to Ethiopia and the Amara region are very standard and basic. What attracted my attention is what they're recommending to the international bodies, partners of Ethiopia, to be vigilant about this issue, to make a permanent item to be discussed at the United Nations or at the Security Council, as well as at the human rights groups. They are calling for funding to accentuate a monitoring group to keep an eye on Ethiopia's human rights situation, past and present. But I think the most interesting thing I like to share with the audience is something that never happened before, which the 2 groups recommend to create and bring about, and I will call comprehensive arms embargo on Ethiopia, unquote. And I think that is, in my opinion, something that we have been waiting for a long time. Where they come short in terms of the report quickly is that they did not really call the world's attention to unsolicited and unpermitted by the Ethiopian government food delivery to the people. They recommended to let food aid go and also resume banks and other services. But I would have liked it if the report established a no-fly zone or recommended a no-fly zone so that the millions who are already died and the ones that soon will be dying, if we follow Abiy's logic, which is to use food aid, weaponized food, I think I would have liked it if that item was included, recommended to the world body to provide food by any means necessary to the people who are starving. And with that, I'm sure my colleagues will comment on this important topic. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. Great. Professor Skel, what stood out for you? I mean, you have been away on travel for the past 3 weeks, I guess. But what stood out for you during the past 7 days?
What stood out for me this week in particular, not the past 3 weeks, is the renewed campaign in Oromia against the OLA, or the forces that they call Shani. Why is this standing out for me? The reason that it stands out for me is that 4 years ago, the supposedly reformist government that invited the OLF back into the country to conduct or participate in the peaceful political process started separating the OLA from the OLF and wage war against the OLA. At the time, the remnants of the Oromo Liberation Army, and I say remnants because part of the Oromo Liberation Army that was in training in Asmara returned to Ethiopia through Tigray and were supposed to be integrated into the Oromia police or special forces. That didn't go well. It didn't go well, and most of those people that actually were supposed to return to peaceful struggle rejoined the OLA. At the time that the Ethiopian government, in 4 years ago, decided to conduct war against the OLA in western Ethiopia and southern Ethiopia, there were a few hundred people who were in the OLA. And the area of operation was around the Sudanese border and the Kenyan border. Today, the forces are in the environment, in the environs of Addis Ababa. They've spread to all areas of Oromia, and the armed combatants are about, counting in the tens of thousands. Exactly what number, I don't know. So 4 years ago, and especially between January the 1st of 2020 and January the 31st of 2020, they conducted a continuous campaign for 30 days to obliterate the OLA strongholds and to do away with the OLA once and for all. They switched off the internet, they switched off telephones, they switched off lights, they established command post administration in all of these places. After all kinds of economic devastation because of the command post rule, after all kinds of violence, today the OLA is operating, as I just said, in the area, in the vicinity of Addis Ababa, and counting the tens of thousands. I don't understand what is going on with these people. The first time that you tried, you got them from the borders of Sudan and Kenya to Addis Ababa. Hundreds of combatants at the time. Now you have in the thousands. Now they have started it again. They have said that they turn the entire apparatus of violence of the government against the OLA. They will unleash indescribable violence against not the OLA, which they will not be able to get to, but the residents of all of those areas where the OLA operates. They have unleashed the violence by using the Oromia police, the Oromia special forces, but as if those forces are not enough, to perpetrate untold violence against the innocent people of Oromia. They have also asked the help of the Somali region and other regions within Ethiopia. This is surprising. After all this violence in northern Ethiopia against Tigray, after all of this violence against the Command and the Agao and the Benishangul and in Oromia, the PP government is still in the state of mind that there is a military solution to political problems in Ethiopia. That simply boggles the mind. That is really what stood out for me, that this country is in the throes of crazy thinking, so to speak. It boggles the mind. It's beyond describable. It's ununderstandable to me, but they have, again, once more, started the rule of violence against Oromo. Again, another round of violence had been unleashed against the Oromo and the residents of Oromia region. That's what stood out for me.
Thank you, Iskel. And this is also a week where we have seen one of the major political opposition parties in Oromia region. The OFC had its General Assembly, and where they were clear about the national dialogue, talk from the government side, and everything what's happening in Ethiopia in terms of security and peace and so on. John, it's again great pleasure to have you back here in a different format now as part of the H panel. So what is your assessment of the big ticket items in the Horn in general, if you will, in Ethiopia in particular over the past 1 week? John, you are muted.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm a big fan of the panel. I always watch it every week. I, in fact, usually sit there with a notepad and take down the wisdom of your panelists. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I'm going to follow Faisal, and also found that this report by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch was extremely interesting, and I think it will also be very influential as we go forward. In the first instance, we know almost nothing about what's been going on in Western Tigray. Tigray itself is under a blackout, but Western Tigray even more so. Secondly, one of the most difficult spheres, I think, to deal with as we go forward in hopefully what will be a peace process at some period will be the status of Western Tigray. So it's given us some insights on that. And then also what's important is the main focus of the report, which was on the human rights abuses, which are probably the worst in all of Ethiopia. And this is the first chance we've actually had to get a reasonable report on the conditions there. So I think this is going to be very significant politically. And I noticed that the US government has already responded positively to the report and the study. Now, the report is, as I see, is already being attacked by some of the friends of the Abiy regime by saying that, of course, they were not on the ground to do the study. But this can hardly be attributed to any failing of Amnesty or Human Rights Watch. They simply were not allowed to get into Western Tigray. But instead, I think they've still done quite a comprehensive report. They interviewed 409 people, most of them refugees in Eastern Sudan, but they also did phone interviews, and they also had satellite imagery and things like that. So they put together a very long, comprehensive, and really very disturbing report. 420 pages of reading of people who have suffered incredible abuses is not a very nice read. But it's always very important that people who have experienced these terrible crimes are given some kind of voice, some kind of recognition of what they've experienced. So I think, again, that this report is going to carry weight. The report itself was done between December 2020 and June 2021. And for the first time, I think we actually got an idea of some of the numbers of people involved. So it's almost 723,000 people from Western Tigray have been displaced, an incredible number. And I think it's something like 52,000 people are in the refugee camps in Eastern Sudan. These are incredibly big numbers. We might recall that when the war first broke out, the UN was predicting that, in fact, there would probably be 200,000 or more refugees arriving in Eastern Sudan. And I think the reason that there wasn't more people is we know that the armed groups, the Eritreans, the Amara groups, the ENDF, were in fact shooting people for a time to stop them from going into Sudan. But we do have those figures. The report itself came to the very strong conclusions that there were crimes against humanity, war crimes, and ethnic displacement of people. What it did not say, and I looked in vain for finding some explanation of why it did not say anything, was about the issue of genocide. A reading of that report strikes me as a non-expert that genocide was conducted, but unfortunately this report neither says that nor explains why they did not consider that in their report. So I think that controversy is still going to be there. Another important element of the report might look like it's on the kind of back page of the report, but I think it's very important, and that is what the report had to say about the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission. Because as you remember, the UN Human Rights Commission jointly produced a research paper with the Ethiopian body, and many people at the time were very critical that the UN of joining hands with this Ethiopian body said that it would not be a legitimate study. And in fact, that's what this study found too. So I was pleased to find that they were actually very critical of that. And particularly, we got a much more nuanced position or understanding of what went on at Mia Kadra, which was very controversial at the time. I don't think that explanation is still full, and I think the authors of the report understand that it's not full, but they do put an awful lot more flesh on the story, which was completely absent in the UN Ethiopian study. And I want to just quote a woman by the name of Sarah Jackson, who is actually the Amnesty International Deputy Regional Director for East Africa, the Horn, and Great Lakes. She said, quote, "Given the complexity and gravity of the situation, a UN-led investigation rather than a joint investigation with Ethiopian institutions is urgently needed to establish the truth and lay the foundations for accountability. There is no time to lose. Work on this must begin now before evidence could be destroyed and memories begin to fade." So I think that was an important statement. The Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, partly because it produced this joint study with the UN, gained an awful lot of credibility. And I think this study by the two biggest human rights organizations in the West is going to go far to undermine and discredit that supposed credibility they have. So I think it's that part was important. Can you just advise me on your procedure here? I can go on and say more about this report, but is it better to leave that for a little bit later in your program?
Yeah, so because the report, like all of you said, it's a very comprehensive one, and it merits its own maybe separate show. So we can connect it as far as it can be connected to the topic of the day, holding Ethiopia together. Is that feasible? Is that worth doing?
Well, I did want to talk about the recommendations because they were quite important. I can do that now, or I can do that later, whatever.
You can keep it for the final thoughts, maybe.
Okay.
Thank you, John. Great. So let's go to the main topic. So we can have different timelines. Pick whatever timeline you want, November 4, 2020, or April 2018, or whatever timeline we can speak about. Is Ethiopian unity, quote unquote? What is the state of that? Is it damaged beyond repair, or there is something to salvage from that? Maybe Faisal, you can start on that, and if it's feasible to keep Ethiopia holding together, and we'll come back to the how, the models and so on. So maybe your assessment on where we are now and what you take on that is. Faisal? You are muted. Okay.
Yeah. I think quickly, with respect to the report that John and I talked about, one silver lining that appears in the report is that in passing, the report mentions past atrocities and crimes carried under the name of the Ethiopian government. So I think the issue is mainly what's wrong with the Ethiopian state, and that's where our discussion today is. I find, after reviewing so much literature that the problem is not because of a single administration, because this report also mentioned is the last atrocity committed mainly against Somalis, which both this groups, Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, detailed what happened in the Somali region, including blockade. It also mentions Oromos and Gambella and what have you. So this takes us to a very serious discussion beyond person, although players are key and important. In my opinion, I think there is a problem with the Ethiopian, if you will, empire. It's an empire that's in a way very unique, in my opinion, different than previous European empires. It's a young empire in a way, but it's the only surviving empire so far. Others died. And I think the name Ethiopia means different things to different people. To Amaras, it means something. To Somalis, it's totally a different thing. It doesn't mean anything to Somalis or to some other people in the South. And I think the atrocity that we are talking about in 2022 is not something that began today. Major Iswaini, who traveled in the Somaliland in 1920s, details literally atrocities that are identical to the ones we are talking about, where Somalis look up to Europeans and say, can you please help us? And the Europeans saying, please, can you help these Mohammedans? And those are their words. Can you please help these Mohammedans to at least be safe from the Ethiopian invasion and the Abyssinian atrocities? And you know, in the Ethiopian Amharic literature, there is the word and the phrase of Zarraf Somali, which literally means kill, loot, rape, and rob everything. So that tells you really the Ethiopian state has been, harassing, carrying atrocities against people, particularly people of the South. I think in the last few years, I would say from the 1970s to the current, the North, which used to be the home of the Ethiopian Empire, and the capacity and the infrastructure of the Ethiopian Empire seems to have lost capacity. There is a sort of a death hanging and hovering on the Amhara Tigrenya, if you will, alliance, which maintained the Ethiopian Empire. To some extent, some Western Oromia were part of that, but nonetheless, we grew up to understand that the Ethiopian colonial, if you will, / empire has been nurtured by these two groups and their elites. That is dead. Not only is it dead, but the worst spectrum of conflict in Ethiopia today is in northern Ethiopia, which used to be the home of the traditional Ethiopian power. I think the loss of the Amhara Tigrenya coexistence, if you will, alliance, the weakening of the Orthodox Church, because when the Tigrayans were being massacred and atrocities were carried against them, even to certain extent, the Orthodox Church, which in the past united these two communities, was playing a significant role in the perpetuation of the atrocities by giving and lending hand to the Ethiopian government and to carry the atrocities. I think all this weigh heavily on the speed at which the Ethiopian state is really decaying. In a sense, it's decayed when you look at the economy, when you look at its governance, when you look at the democratic practices or the lack thereof. So the question is not really whether the Ethiopian state and that empire is salvageable. It's to what extent can you save the Ethiopian empire? And in light of what had happened in the last few years, and I will start this from the 1970s when Somalis, close to 1.5 million Somalis were ejected and ethnic cleansed out of their neighborhoods and their regions, to what happened in the Oromo history and southern Gurubis, whether it's feudalism or being relegated to a second-class citizen in terms of citizenship. all those factors and those historical weight, in addition to the denial that comes from those who consider Ethiopia a perfect or a more preferable form of state, are putting stress on Ethiopia. I think if solutions are not being found, and maybe I will later on talk about what I think to be some of the recommendations and the solutions, but you have an empire that's dying, that you have an empire whose center has decayed and lost any teeth to hold it to its main tenants, and you have people who do have different meaning and different interpretations of what Ethiopia is. Those who love very much because they have been the beneficiaries, and those who see the entire concept of Ethiopian state as enemy. Where is the middle ground? Is the pull and push factor that's stressing Ethiopia finally coming home to roost, in which case we are getting to a point where Ethiopia's state is no longer feasible and sustainable the way it is today. And what changes do we need, and what modalities do we need to really alter the kind of state that has relegated, I would say, to the majority of Ethiopians, whether you parcel that majority in terms of ethnic groups and call them ethnic groups, or geographic groups, or linguistic groups, or even class groups. The last 100 years that Ethiopian state had the form of face is not appealing to the majority of Ethiopians. So what do you do? Do you walk away from it? Are there tools to reform? We can talk about this, but I think history provides us a very good analysis on the Ethiopian state to have had troubles, and those troubles are deeper than what the day-to-day news that we often parcel tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Faisal. I will go with the same question to Scale. The other day, I was listening to an interview with Brahanu Bayo, who was the foreign affairs minister of the Derg region, who was in the Italian embassy for, I think, 27 years. And he was on the national national TV, speaking about how Abiy Ahmed came as a savior of Ethiopia, and Ethiopia is on the right track. And this is a kind of narrative we hear a lot from those who are close to Arakilo. Scale, what is your assessment where Ethiopia is now in terms of whether it's feasible to keep it together, to hold it together?
Well, that's a very large question that let's kind of take them in parts. But what you just said about Brahanu Bayi, not only Brahanu Bayi, but another guy who was in the Italian embassy for 27 years is also on television talking about Abiy Ahmed and how good he is for Ethiopia. That's a weird thing to do. That the military government that dragged Ethiopia into war, into the gutters, and destroyed Ethiopia's economy and Ethiopia's image on the world stage, the Derg government, officials of the Derg government who were in hiding in the Ethiopian and Italian embassy for 20 years are now the sages of Ethiopia. Now they're talking about how good Abiy Ahmed is. It's a weird thing that even Abiy Ahmed wants their testimony, the testimony of Derg officials, to tell Ethiopians how good Abiy Ahmed is for Ethiopia. It's completely, I don't know what word I can use except say that it is really weird. It's a topsy-turvy world in which former Derg officials are now speaking about Ethiopia's greatness and the greatness of their leader. But that's emblematic of what has happened to Ethiopia. Now, and you said something about the assessment of the state of damage to Ethiopia's unity or the Ethiopian polity. Where do you start? Where do you start? In addition to, if you set aside the damage that was done to constitutionalism, the damage that was done to the one possibility that Ethiopia had to remain together as a functioning polity, the multinational federalism, the damage that was done to the economy, the damage done to foreign policy. There is no limit to the to the damage that was done to Ethiopia, the Ethiopian polity. But look at it only from what perspective? From the perspective of Eritrea's intervention to Ethiopia. Eritrean intervention in Ethiopia that is allowed by the Ethiopian government, it has done damage to Ethiopia's sovereignty. If that is what matters to any state, any polity, that sovereignty is the cherished goal of any state, now Ethiopia doesn't have it. Eritrea decides on matters of war and peace. Eritrea decides on matters of security and intelligence in Ethiopia. Eritrea decides on the Ethiopian economy and foreign policy. The Eritreans are everywhere in the Ethiopia. It's all pervasive on the legal and informal sector that Eritrea is really making decisions about Ethiopia. And if a country has lost its sovereignty and this time willingly surrendered the Ethiopian government's power to make decisions on all of those things and surrendered to Eritrea, what more damage can one expect about the Ethiopian polity? Eritrea conceived, Eritrea planned, Eritrean officials executed the war against Tigray and now against Oromia. And when they do so with the clearest intention of annihilating Tigrayans and beating Tigray back to the Stone Age by destroying whatever the Tigray government had built over the last 30 years in terms of economic infrastructure, hospitals, universities, and schools. Eritrea simply destroyed it. There is no ENDF now, Ethiopian National Defense Force in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian military has acted as a mercenary force in the service of the Eritrean regime, killing innocents, raping and pillaging and rampaging through urban areas in Ethiopia. There isn't more damage that could be done to any state than violating its sovereignty. Second, the second damage is to the Ethiopian effort to democratize. What we see today, what was hoped for, was that Ethiopia's democratization might spill over to Eritrea. Instead, what we got is the Eritreanization of Ethiopia. What we witnessed is the autocratization of Ethiopia, the reversal of democratization in Ethiopia, Eritrea's resolute opposition to constitutionalism, to constitutional rule, to democratization and democracy, to multinational federalism in Ethiopia has taken hold. What Eritrea did to Eritrea, Ethiopia is now doing to itself because of the Eritrean direction in Ethiopia. The damage is extensive, that Ethiopia's hoped for transition to democracy has been scuttled by Eritrea. Now Ethiopia is more looking more like Eritrea than the other way around. I don't understand why Ethiopian leader is so affectionate towards the Eritrean dictator. I can understand why he might need Eritrea's help in dealing with the opposition within Ethiopia, but there is an unexplained affinity, unexplained personal affection towards the Eritrean leader. He has no qualms of importing wholesale everything that made Eritrea an international pariah. Now Ethiopia is also an international pariah. It can go on. The rise of Amhara expansionism, Amhara hegemony, Amhara restoration of the past imperial rule in Ethiopia, and they say it on television without any qualms, any regret that what they had done had caused Ethiopia, brought Ethiopia to the verge of collapse. So economic stagnation, diplomatic isolation, political repression, interminable warfare, criminalization of the opposition, extrajudicial killing, massive imprisonment, suppression of freedom of speech and assembly. This is what characterizes the Ethiopian body politic. The damage is really extensive. I could go on about the rise of the rhetoric of hate hate within Ethiopia because of Eritrea. So the damage that Eritrean had caused to Ethiopia is really pervasive, really extensive. The entire body politic of Ethiopia has now been dismantled, and that's what Eritrea wants: dismantling Ethiopia, weakening it, and then relegating it to the heap of history. And why Ethiopians? When the country is sold, when every asset of Ethiopia, the military, the economy, the security is sold and mortgaged to another country, it doesn't bother Ethiopians. It doesn't bother the Ethiopian elite. They're not bothered by it at all. That is the surprising thing about the damage that was done to Ethiopia, to Ethiopia's polity, Ethiopia's unity, Ethiopia's viability as a country is so deep and pervasive that I don't think that one can revive the Ethiopian state anymore. But we'll come to what choices that Ethiopia had, but the depth and the pervasiveness of it. If you look at it from the Eritrean intervention in Ethiopia, that there is really no Ethiopian polity right now. And the worst part of it is the Ethiopian elite that was railing against Eritrea for the last 30 years, the Amhara elite, they have absolutely no concern that all of this has been caused, the damage had been caused to Ethiopian polity altogether.
Great, thank you, Ezekiel. John, I want to come to you with the same question. So, just months ago, you co-published the book, The Nation State. And in the chapter you wrote this, I just want to quote directly, if I can show that to our viewers, I'm not sure, but let me quote you here. Abiy's vision for Ethiopia harkens back to a golden age of pan-Ethiopian unity in the absence of ethnic conflict under unitary governments. Then you continue, unfortunately, there was no such golden age, and instead, there is a long history of Ethiopian emperors and the Derg trying to overcome national revolts at great human cost. End of quote. This is what from your chapter. What is your assessment where Ethiopia is? Actually, that chapter you started from November 4. The first statement you talk about is what happened on November 4, 2020. So on the same question, Faisal and Ezekiel answered, what is your assessment of Ethiopian unity, and is Ethiopia feasible to keep it the way it has been? John.
Yeah, I think we have to, at least from an international perspective, sort of step back a little bit and appreciate that for many Africans, and actually many people outside of Africa who at least have some interest in Africa, Ethiopia still has something of a vision of a beacon, that it still has a status derived from the fact that it was not colonized. And I think a lot of the goodwill that's directed at this awful government in Addis Ababa right now is because of that heritage or that kind of perspective. Of course, once you seriously look at Ethiopia, as my two colleagues pointed out very graphically, the Ethiopia you see is one where, until very recently anyway, we weren't talking about citizens, we were talking about subjects, we were talking about empires, and we were talking about massive and systemic repression of all sorts of different ethnic communities throughout Ethiopia. That becomes the reality. It didn't fundamentally change even with the end of the imperial era. We were still left with an extremely brutal and Amhara-centric regime under the Derg. I think, and maybe I'm a bit naive, that there was a sincere attempt under the EPRDF to deal with the national question in a constructive way. I don't think that if Ethiopia is to survive, and I'm not optimistic about that at all, that it would need some system of multinational federalism. Clearly, we've seen enormous flaws in that system. And when we actually turn to Tigray, I think the Tigrayans have completely given up on the system. I think there's a sense, which is not mistaken, that the war that began in November 2020 was formative in making that decision of average Tigrayans. But I think there was a lot of skepticism among Tigrayans that went back many, many years. I can remember living in Addis Ababa in the 1990s and constantly hearing the rhetoric of how the TPLF had poisoned the country and poisoned Tigrayans with their ethnicity and their narrow Tigrayan nationalism. But the reality actually was quite different. The leadership of the TPLF that I knew were in fact of a pan-Ethiopian character. But the reality was that operating in the context of Ethiopia, in the context of Tigray, meant ascribing to Tigrayan nationalism. There simply wasn't any other way of making a revolution, of changing the conditions without building on that kind of nationalism. And hence, what followed was this notion of national federalism, which was not some kind of unique product of the TPLF, as I pointed out in the chapter that we just mentioned. It was derived basically chapter and verse from the early experience of the Bolsheviks in the early years of the Soviet Revolution. That's where most of these ideas came from. But interesting enough, those ideas of national federalism were designed to keep the Russian entity or the Soviet entity in place. It was a means of preserving unity. And I think the only way that unity could have been preserved after the Derg was defeated was through some kind of system of national federalism. And this is what the TPLF basically put to the Tigrayans, and more broadly, they put to the country. But it was always the sense that national federalism was the focus, but with national federalism also had an opt-out clause that, and this was of course placed prominently in the Ethiopian constitution, is that if people did not feel satisfied with their position in the country, that there was not only a right to secession, but actually an organized process to achieve that right. And I think we get a very clear sense of at least the attitudes of Tigrayans to their place in Ethiopia in 1989. Because in 1989, the TPLF had captured all of Tigray, and it actually began a march south with their allies to capture Addis Ababa. And to the shock of Tigrayan fighters and also their families in Tigray, they found themselves being attacked not just by the Derg, but by ordinary Amara and Oromo. And this was very shocking to the people of Tigray. And in fact, most of the army at that point basically dissolved. And the fighters went back to Tigray. And the general attitude in Tigray, as best I can understand it, was one of, let's forget Ethiopia. Let's give up on Ethiopia. Let's declare our own independent state. So I think that expressed very graphically what the attitudes of Tigrayans were at that time. And I think that was consistent with their views for many, many years. But the TPLF response to that was to engage in a long and quite complicated political exercise of convincing people not to opt for independence at that point, which again stressed the Ethiopian character of the TPLF. It wasn't really the way it was presented by the Amara elites at all. But again, the selling point was crucially that there was an opt-out provision, that it was going to be placed in the Constitution, and of course it subsequently was. Unfortunately, the Constitution in the course of this war has been effectively thrown out the window. So it simply doesn't really exist, which is very unfortunate, because if, as I suspect, Ethiopia may well disintegrate, you had a process, you had procedures there where you could have gone about this process in a much more orderly way and hopefully escape the violence. And that was the intention of the Constitution, particularly after a 30-year war with Eritrea. The sense in the country was, we don't want to go through this again. We want to have mechanisms and processes by which we can deal with this any problems that arise in a constructive and in a civilized way. But that hasn't happened. And I think the war that broke out in November 2020 was finally the final statement, at least, or the Tigrayans at that point. I don't think there was really much doubt about where they stood. So in my perspective, my reading of the tea leaves, at least in Tigray, was that it's not a question of if Tigray will separate, it's a question of when Tigray will separate. It's a question of what conditions, under what conditions Tigray will separate. And crucially, the question will also be of what the borders will be of Tigray. So I think that's where we are with Tigray. The issue of, more broadly, Ethiopia is I find very complicated, and I don't feel entirely qualified to comment on. But I think we have to see Ethiopia ultimately through realist kind of eyes and see it ultimately as a failure. We not only have lost Eritrea, I have no doubt that Tigray will go at some point. As I say, I don't know when. But these are major pieces and peoples of the country which have been lost. And I think this may well set forth a kind of crescendo of a further disintegration of the country. The other question you asked, which I've tried to entertain a little bit myself, is there any kind of mechanisms or structures that could replace this? Now, I don't really see any kind of structures that could replace the Ethiopian state. I've heard some people, some academics talk about perhaps some kind of model like the European Union. I don't think that's realistic. I think for people who are not wanting to be part of Ethiopia, who want to secede from Ethiopia, that they would not be prepared to accept such a centralized state. On the other hand, I think there definitely is a need for some kind of mechanisms. I don't know what form they would take, but clearly, even if Ethiopia does disintegrate, there are going to be problems of movement of people, movement of capital, human trafficking, what one can imagine, innumerable kind of issues that would have to be dealt with. There might be, hopefully there would be some kind of mechanism to deal with that. But I think the principle would have to be that just as in the Ethiopian constitution, power is based on the nations, nationalities, and peoples of Ethiopia, any centralized mechanism, their powers would have to be derived and delegated from the nations and nationalities and peoples of Ethiopia, not the other way around. But beyond that broad principle, I'm really at a loss as to how this whole process could unfold.
Thank you, John. Maybe for our viewers, John's PhD and published as a book, his work on peasant revolution in Ethiopia, the Tigray People's Liberation Front, 1971 is a good read in terms of that, the nitty-gritty details of the revolution in Tigray. I think you answered the last question that I will be throwing to both Faisal and Scale. So the notion of short of disintegration, what mechanisms can, the people, the elite think of, or if there is any model that the country, the nation, whatever we can call it, can learn from Faisal?
Yes, I'm glad John, in his conclusion, said that he is qualified to speak about Tigray in detail, but not others, and I quite agree with him. I think if John believes that, which I concur to a certain extent, given the current history, the recent history of atrocities, that there may not be enough guts among Tigraynya politicians, including TPLF, to bring back the hearts of Tigrayans back to a united Ethiopia. The jury's out there, but that's also my read. But what I like to share with John is that the Somalis are even more extreme than the Tigrayans. Number one, they have no history with Ethiopia. The last annexation of the Somali territory to Ethiopia was 1954. It's just around the corner. If I personalize that message, my dad had a British marriage certificate because the consulate of the British that was still administering Somali Howden Reserve area was still in Jijiga, despite the 1900s invention and expeditions by Ras Mokonnen during the Jalanko and the Harab War. And the same history is shared with Somalis by Eastern Oromia, all the way to Borana, where there is no connectivity with the Ethiopian state. And even take that further, when this current constitution was promulgated in the charter form in 1991 in London, Somalis walked out. The Ogaden National Liberation Front walked out because they didn't see their interests being addressed. Even that constitution charter that you now call a more progressive, because of the weight of history on Somalis and the lack of any connectivity to the Ethiopian state except atrocities. So they are even in a more far-flung position than the Tigrays. Somalis are only in Ethiopia by the brute force. And I'm just putting the ugly reality to us, because until now, Somalis were cajoled and forced and coerced and at times terrorized to be part of Ethiopia. In the current situation, the Abiy's government doesn't have any relationship in terms of, heart to heart with the Somali masses, except with the person that he picked up as a president of the region. Even I talked to his ministers, even his closest ministers don't believe what the local regional president who reports to Abiy believes. That's how far Somalis are removed from, if you really go by the democratic ethos, a lot of people may opt out of this, including Somalis, Tigrays, even Benishangul and what have you, Gambela. We don't know, but at least I can speak of the Somali experience. Having said that, I think there are, given the current situation in which we are, there are scenarios that are frightening, and then there are scenarios that we can say we could live with. I think a Yugoslavia-style disintegration is a very frightening scenario. We already see what's happening in northern Ethiopia. As you mentioned, the population movement and transfer of people could happen in many, many regions. When state bulks and collapses, many things happen. So that's really the least desirable, but that's looming large. Whether we like it or not, it was like 3-4 years ago when 6 former ambassadors to Addis Ababa met at the US Institute for Peace and really warned about that disintegration looming large. The other one is a managed kind of, letting the air out of the Ethiopian empire. For instance, the way the Russians did with Poland. Is Ethiopia ready to let some of the extreme regions and the peripheral regions where governance never reached, and both you and probably John Mercakis talk about that, and I really talk in detail about that, how Ethiopia's governance didn't reach the Somali, the Borana, what have you. Is there a possibility where groups like Somalis would be allowed to get out of the empire? But that may also have its own problems with the Somali, the Oromo integration, the Oromo, the Amhara integration. So that's another challenge. I think a very I don't know if the current situation in which we are is the precursor of a total disintegration of the Ethiopian state as we know it, or the labor that precedes the birth of a democratic system, as Scale was touching on the ages. Those two processes can both be there. Is it? Are we witnessing the growing pains of democratic transition? And we know Europe had gone through so many wars before it got to where it is, or this is the cloud of disintegration really hovering up. We don't know, but we do know is that if we want to go even over the hump in the coming 5 years, 10 years, we need to do some rearrangement of power. I think Oromos, in my opinion, and I'm the last person to probably be saying this, is in a piece I wrote. It's in Oromos sit in the belly of the hyena, if you will. They sit in the middle of all these ethnic groups, and they probably have the most extended relationships with most of the nationalities and nations in Ethiopia, unlike Tigray, which was on the far flank. With Tigray also, there has been good willing and good wishes that have been created between Oromos and Tigrays with the current situation, with their commitment to multinational federalism, if you will, if peace is for. I think a democratic power that comes from the Oromo region, in my opinion, can probably use its majority weight, its geographic location, its nature of being the breadbasket of Ethiopia. The question is, do we have that leadership from the Oromo elite and the Oromo groups? And I'm saying that's only a short term. If you don't have that, Ethiopia can either disintegrate or there has to be a model to let some of the energy be released. Those energies could be Tigray being released, Somali being released, and what have you. And with that, I will stop.
Great. Thank you, Faisal. Same Scale.
I mean, looking at where we are, you can analyze these things from the perspective of what might happen to Tigray. I agree with that. What John said. I cannot see Tigray or anyone in Ethiopia asking the Tigrayans to forget it all and join Ethiopia anew. I don't know any mechanism by which you can disarm the Tigray region and be slaughtered again by the Ethiopian National Defense Forces and in collaboration with Eritrea. On what ground one could ask the Tigray to remain in Ethiopia, integrate in Ethiopia, and disarm and become loyal citizens in Ethiopia? I cannot imagine that. Or from the Somali side, like Faisal was talking about, the Somali region has never been politically or economically integrated, and there was even no effort. In fact, for the 60 years or 70 years that the Somali region had been in Ethiopia, Somalis have seen only carnage, not integration. To think that they would now, after seeing what happened in Tigray, and the willingness of the Ethiopian elite, the Amhara elite, to do whatever is necessary to keep power, I don't know if you can expect the Somali to start the integration. So what you see in Ethiopia today is the falling apart, the unfolding, the unraveling of the empire. What we see in Ethiopia first is the failure of the effort at national integration. Since its inception, since the inception of the empire, several formulas have been tried to transform Ethiopia, the Ethiopian empire, stitched together by violence into a stable polity in which subjects had been converted to citizens. The only formula that could have worked was the one that grew out of the political settlement of the early 1990s, and that is the the settlement that envisioned Ethiopia as a political community of self-governing nations and nationalities with shared sovereignty with the center. That was a formula. That was a political settlement. That had contributed to reduction in intercommunal violence. It had led to some relative uh, stability in the country and security for people to move from one place to another within the country, and had led to rapid economic growth. In the last 3 years, an allegedly reformist cabal tried to replace this formula that seemed to have worked by a return to the past, by bringing back a unitary state with a Leviathan at the pinnacle of a centralized authority of an unified Ethiopian nation, uh, with no regard to ethnic distinctions. That project of national integration that seemed to have worked had now unraveled. The result is now a chaotic and messy situation in which the uncertainties prevail and the specter of state collapse is gathering clouds over Addis Ababa. The century old effort of national integration had completely failed. We tried, the last attempt was the multinational federation. That had been erased, that had been failed. And there is no way that you can put it together. Tigray is gone, Somali is gone. The center that Faisal talked about, Oromia, is dissatisfied with the status quo. They cannot live, Oromos cannot live with Ethiopia in which living as an Oromo is criminalized as a threat to national security. And that's the rhetoric that we hear from the Ethiopian elite. There was a possibility for Ethiopia to remain multinational, uh, uh, a multinational constitutional federal democracy through democratization of the federation. There was an effort here that started in 2018 to democratize Ethiopia, but now the hope, the spring of hope of democratic transition of 2018 had been replaced by the winter of carnage, of war crimes and reign of terror and myriad acts of indescribable cruelty that is bereft of any sentiment of any common humanity. If national integration had failed, if democratization had failed, there is no way that you can keep it together, much less look for a formula that will keep it together. The people that always talk about keeping Ethiopia's integrity, territorial integrity, and unity are the ones that are now in charge of the dismantling of the policy. In the name of keeping it together, they have completely dismantled any formula that might have worked, completely destroyed it. Instead, what do you see? After the failure of national integration and after the failure of democratization, what you see in Ethiopia today is the rise of the rhetoric of hate. The current high-pitched political rhetoric is openly calls for ethnic cleansing and genocide. Armed forces in Ethiopia are trained. New recruits are imbued with the ethos of annihilation by the government of Ethiopia. And any opposition is considered an enemy of the state, as if the distraction that occurred over the last 18 months is not enough. Now the government calls for a permanent conflict in the airwaves. The values of constitutional democracy, the one of the rule of law and democratic governance have now been replaced by the voice of expansionism, fascism, and xenophobia. The absence of an accountability for the people in high offices in the government of Ethiopia. When they call for genocide and ethnic cleansing, That presages an ominous political dispensation coming in Ethiopia. So what we're seeing today is the rise of warlordism, lawlessness, and the attempt at restoration of the imperial period by using any means necessary. So the issue today about Ethiopia is not how to keep it together. Many experts about Ethiopia speak of a worst case scenario by suggesting that Ethiopia is facing the fate of Yugoslavia. That many observers of the Ethiopian scene see the Yugoslavianization of Ethiopia as the worst case scenario. What we are looking at is not the Yugoslavianization of Ethiopia, but the Rwandization of Ethiopia. The question shouldn't be about search for models of holding an empire together. An empire cannot be democratized. The multinational federalism with self-governing nations had worked, and that would have been the only path to a national integration and democratization and holding the policy together. That is unacceptable to the Ethiopian elite. What they will get is the complete collapse, but the blood spilling will continue. So there is no model that could work for Ethiopia anymore than the multinational federation. No Commonwealth of Independent States, maybe confederation of independent states, maybe. I don't know, but I don't see that you can look for models. The time is not looking for models that might work. It absolutely is not. What you see is the Rwandization of Ethiopia. That is what I see, and I cannot see any way out of this when the specter of collapse, what is gathering, the clouds that are gathering over the skies of Addis Ababa, is not about the search for models, workable models. What was offered was rejected, and there is a fervent opposition to the restoration of the imperial period in Ethiopia right now.
Thank you, Ezekiel. One of the very important observations that one can make is there is no discussion about this in the mainstream media or in whatever media we can speak of. And the latest message from the Prime Minister regarding the national dialogue is, I believe it's the last word from his side in terms of saying, if people cannot use this opportunity, this could be a historic mistake and so on. Maybe this is something that we can come back to in another panel. Let's go to the final thoughts. John, final thoughts for the day from your side. You are muted.
Follow up on some of the things Ezekiel said, because I was very impressed and I found his statements incredibly profound and also very, very disturbing. Although I think a very realistic kind of assessment. I think where I'm coming from, in a sense, is seeing these models of the state and democracy as being foreign imports. I mean, the article or the chapter you just referred to that I wrote, Getachew, was actually on a book on the failure of the nation state in the Horn of Africa. And of course, the experience of secession of Eritrea and South Sudan, and we're now talking about the potential dissolution of Ethiopia, suggests that this model, this transplanted foreign model, has not been effective, not only in the Horn of Africa, but it rarely has been effective anywhere in Africa. And I'm now in the process of completing a book basically on the same theme, but with respect to democracy. That these ideals and these models of democracy, which are trying to be implemented in Africa, have likewise proved to be a complete failure. So we're talking about systems which are inappropriate for the conditions in these countries, but it certainly leaves us in a very difficult situation. And I think because of that, I think that explains so much of the support of the West, particularly for the Abiy government. If we remember a few months back, the critics of the opposition in Ethiopia were saying that, of course, the Americans and the West were on the side of the TPLF, which was always nonsensical, simply because the agenda of the TPLF or the OLA was to bring about the disintegration of the country. And ultimately, what the West policy is all about in Africa and in Ethiopia is maintaining the status quo, no matter what the cost of that status quo is to the people who live in these countries. So when we're talking about the disintegration of Ethiopia, we're going to be also having to confront an enormous amount of resistance and head in the sand kind of approach from the West. My final comments actually go back, so it's a bit of a jump, I guess, go back to the report of Amnesty and Human Rights Watch, because they make a large number of proposals, some of them which sounds very good, most of which, of course, will be dismissed, particularly by the government. But there was one I wanted to draw people's attention to because I'm concerned about it, and that is their proposal that there be an African Union peacekeeping mission that is placed on the ground in Western Tigray. And I think that whole notion is extremely problematic. And they didn't really explain why they suggested the African Union. Presumably, the logic is that the African Union is the main security or political organization on the continent, that they wanted to give it credibility. And I think a lot of people are prey to this rather loose slogan of African solutions to African problems, which the slogan sounds very good. In practice, not so much. And I wanted to speak just briefly on the experience of the African Union peacekeeping mission in Darfur, neighboring country of Sudan, where it was not effective at all. And to provide just a little bit of background for it, when things were getting very much out of hand in Darfur, the killing was in the front pages of all the newspapers, it was on TV, it was everywhere you were looking in around 2000, 2001, 2003, in that period. So the government, the National Congress government in Ethiopia, was under enormous pressure to bring in some kind of peacekeeping mission. And initially the talk was actually of a UN mission, but realizing that the government really had no option but to accept some kind of peacekeeping mission, they very clearly opted for the African Union. And Sudan being somewhat different than Ethiopia, where politicians actually talk rather frankly, politicians certainly told me why they chose the African Union, and it was because they viewed the African Union as being extremely corrupt, and that the peacekeeping mission could be readily manipulated, much more so than the UN. That is actually the way they spoke. And I was in Darfur at the time of the African Union mission being established on the ground, and I got a very similar message actually from Darfuris. They did not want the African Union on the ground for the very same reason that the government did want it on the ground, is they didn't see that they would be effective. They didn't see that they would protect them. Their argument usually was that these were armies from countries where they abused their own people, so they did not think they would be confident that they would protect the people in Darfur. And in fact, the mission was basically disastrous, and it had to be aligned with or integrated with the UN mission. So in fact, it was the first time the UN had a hybrid mission with the AU. So, but I think you have to appreciate the kind of politics, I think, behind the international community, and particularly the international NGOs, which are often very influential in this kind of situation, is that they would not be prepared to represent the views of people of Darfur because they were politically incorrect. That was the bottom line. Now, in suggesting that the UN peacekeeping mission in Darfur or in Western Tigray would be a much better option, it's not to say that the UN is free of problems. We know that UN peacekeeping missions elsewhere in Africa have involved cases of corruption, sexual abuse. There's been numerous problems with them. But when compared to African Union missions, what you will see is that they're better organized, they're better led, they're more experienced, and they work much more effectively. And crucially, they're less likely to be politically manipulated. And bearing in mind that the headquarters of the AU is in Addis Ababa, which gives Ethiopia a disproportionate amount of kind of influence on any kind of potential peacekeeping mission. I think that's very important to bear in mind. Now, obviously, in the present context, it's the government in Addis Ababa would not consider any kind of peacekeeping mission either in Western Tigray or anywhere else in the country. But conditions change, and we might well see that this proposal by Amnesty and Human Rights Watch does come up, and at some point may be a feasible option. So that should be borne in mind.
Thank you, John. And the African Union actually mentioned that in the first months and weeks of the war, it used the terminology used by Abiy government, saying it is a law enforcement operation. So there is a lot of suspicion in terms of how it will be seen. Faisal, you wanna say something on that? And
Yeah, I just want to quickly add what the experience of Somalia when it comes to Africa Union and AMISOM presence. I think Somalis are now sort of like looking back and regretting the day some of the leaders at the time, as part of their reconciliation, agreed, AU to come in and bring AMISOM with the help of the United Nations in terms of payment and equipment and what have you. They have carried more rapes in Somalia than what the warlords and their troops did. Somalis in the civil war, at least because of the Islamic ethos, rape and things like that, and the nomadic culture that says you don't touch elderly, you don't touch women and children. There are no records that show any of those groups were hurt. But when the AU and AMISOM troops came, they did everything. They killed the people with wanton. They raped the Somali women. There is an entire generation now that are, came as a result of those rape. And as of yesterday, the Prime Minister Roble of Somalia granted person non grata to Francis Medera, who is the AU ambassador to Somalia, and they kicked him out. He's not the first one. And many times Somalia tried to get the AMISOM troops and the entire AU out of this country. And exactly, John is right. With Addis Ababa being the headquarters, literally IGAD and partly AU sometimes is a tool for the Ethiopian government that sits at Addis Ababa. And I'm glad that issue came up. Also, part of the recommendation with the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch includes to suspend the UN's utilization of Ethiopian Army, NDF, to serve in any capacity of UN peacekeeping in the world. So basically, both AMISOM and AU, as well as Ethiopian government, is tainted here. So I completely agree. It's the worst experience Somalis have seen with the introduction of AU troops. Not only did they do these crimes themselves, but the Somali politics is corrupted by far, AU and IGAD and AMISOM. So I don't think they will help in the case of Tigray in iota in the future.
Okay, thank you, Faisal. Final words from you, Iskia.
At some point, you said that the Prime Minister of Ethiopia today said that the national dialogue is the last hope The last hope for what? I don't know, but the last hope to save the Ethiopia from disintegration is probably wrong about it, because the national dialogue has already been described as dead on arrival for good reasons. A national dialogue cannot be conducted in the midst of a civil war, a raging civil war. Number two, the national dialogue can succeed only if it fulfills the 6 or 7 requirements of inclusivity, autonomy, transparency, and so on. Many principles that are important to the success of a national dialogue. That hasn't happened in the design of the National Dialogue Commission in Ethiopia. And thirdly, it's not the time. Right now is not the time to use the national dialogue approach to resolving political problems that have descended into a civil war. This is not the time, because the capacity of the Ethiopian body politic to deal with the real issues that could have been done when the Oromo Congress and others have suggested what is needed in the country is a national dialogue that would have led to a new national compact. We're past that right now, so the national dialogue itself, by any means, would not be the cure for the ills of Ethiopia at this point in time. It just is not the right, appropriate formula. As the report that Faisal and John have been talking about, that important human rights and Amnesty International joint report, what it says is that ethnic cleansing had been committed in Western Tigray, and of course in many other places in Ethiopia. War crimes have been committed in Western Tigray and many other places in Ethiopia. I believe, the report hadn't said, but I believe that genocide had been committed in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is gearing up for more genocide in their rhetoric, in their political rhetoric, and in their military preparations. More genocide. That's what Ethiopia is preparing for. So even in a situation where ethnic cleansing and war crimes and other atrocity crimes had been committed, a national dialogue that would probably cancel Article 39, or maybe change the constitution, or reform the multinational structure, or maybe take the star in the middle of the Ethiopian flag and replace it with something else, that is not going to redress the crimes that had been perpetrated by Ethiopian forces. So it's not just an answer. Ethiopia needs another formula. To my understanding, what Ethiopia needs is what the entire world did in the case of Yugoslavia. Assemble a Dayton peace process type process for Ethiopia, because Ethiopia alone, Ethiopia within the national context, or as the Secretary General of the United Nations once said, an Ethiopia-led national dialogue. Beyond that, we're past that. Ethiopia cannot dig out of its quagmire right now. It needs the help of the region and the international community, and probably to obviate the possibility of further carnage, what Ethiopia would need is a national salvation convention with the aid of a Dayton type process. Save that. If that is not done, I don't know if you can forestall the possibility of more carnage and more civil war in Ethiopia.
Great, thank you, Ezekiel, for that final word, and that ends our show today. And we'll be back with yet another episode of the H Panel next week. Thank you, gentlemen, and good night from here. You have been following live on Facebook, YouTube, LinkedIn, and Twitter on the H Panel. Today's topic was, is holding Ethiopia together feasible? Is it worth the effort, given what has happened in Tigray and elsewhere in the country? The panelists today, Dr. John Yang, Faisal Robla, and Professor Eskel, touched on the topic. Please share, subscribe, like, so that we get more viewers for our content. And tomorrow we'll have a show in Amharic. I need to make an ad on that in Amharic. ነገ 5 ፒኤም ኢስተርን ታይም 5 ፒኤም ኢስተርን ታይም ከማስተዋል ታደሰ ጋር ራስን የመሆንና የመጠየቅ ዋጋ በሚል ርዕስ እንነጋገራለን። ማስተዋል ታደሰ የህግ ባለሙያ ነች። ከአሁን በፊት በዩኤምዲ ሚዲያ ቀደም ብሎ ቀርባ ነበረ። ኢትዮጵያ ወዴት በሚል የምታስታውሱት ትኖራላችሁ። እንዳያመልጣችሁ። ነገ ላይቭ 5 ፒኤም ኢስተርን ታይም ከማስተዋል ታደሰ ጋር ራስን የመሆንና የመጠየቅ ዋጋ በሚለው እንመለሳለን። The H panel signs off today with this, and then we'll see you tomorrow in that Amharic show. And I'll be sharing this from the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch report.
Six militia came to loot my shop. 2 of them raped me. They said, "You Tigrayan, you should disappear from the land west of the Kaza. You are evil, and we are purifying your blood."
They lined us up in rows, cocked their guns, and sprayed us with bullets. We fell in the ditch below. After that, they said, "Tigrayans don't die easily. Shoot again."